This is episode 332 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can support the work we do here and help us keep the show on the air with really great guests coming to share amazing history with you every week by becoming a patron at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. You can join today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Hebron, head of drama at Winchester College and author of Prospero, a Renaissance Magus for the British Library. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Where one John Minot, and interesting, he's a lay reader for a parish church. So this is a guy who's licensed to church. I mean, licensed to preach. So he's presumably not completely ignorant and conduct, religious services. Nonetheless, quote, hath openly and manifestly reported that there is no God, no devil, no heaven, no hell, no life after this life, no judgment to come.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
To live in England during Shakespeare's lifetime was to be Protestant, or at least as far as the Queen was concerned. The lack of religious freedom in early modern England doesn't mean that alternative belief systems didn't exist, only that they were hidden. One powerful belief system that riled up conservative members of society and incited objection pamphlets to be written is atheism. Here today to discuss the real people from Shakespeare's lifetime who were labeled as atheists, the punishment if you were accused of being an atheist, as well as the differences among exactly what this meant to be an atheist. We are turning to Peter Herman, the author of the book Early Modern Others, to find out exactly what it meant to be atheist in Shakespeare's lifetime. Peter C. Herman has written numerous books, including Early Modern Others, Resisting Bias in Renaissance Literature, Unspeakable Literature and Terrorism from the Gunpowder Plot to 9/11, and Destabilizing Milton, Paradise Lost, and the Poetics of Incertitude. His public-facing articles have appeared in Inside Higher Ed, Newsweek, and Salon. His article, Reading Philip Roth After the 7th of October, is forthcoming at Quillette. He teaches at San Diego University. Find out more about Peter and links to his work in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Peter. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life. So glad to have you here with us today.
So glad to be here. So just thanks for asking me.
In Shakespeare's lifetime, was atheism defined as someone who does not believe there is a God?
Hardly. During Shakespeare's lifetime, there were multiple meanings for atheism. Broadly speaking, atheism was used as a kind of catch-all term for really anything you didn't like. In some ways, it was kind of like terrorism today. You didn't like someone, you called them an atheist. So you have lots of sermons saying, lots of books calling Catholics atheists, for example, and they did the same. I just read one today where someone said that Calvin, of all people, teaches atheism. So Jews are atheists, Muslims are atheists, Catholics are atheists, Protestants are atheists. Everybody seems to be an atheist if you don't like what they were doing. That being said, there were two other meanings for atheism that were current in this period. The first is the contemporary one, that there is no God. Second, and in some ways, this is the most frightening one. There is a God, there is a supernatural being who created everything, but no justice, no afterlife, or if there is an afterlife, everyone gets exactly the same. So that there is, as I said, no justice at all. So all of these meanings are floating around. Sometimes they overlap with each other. Sometimes they're a little bit more specific. I mean, when a Catholic polemicist says that Queen Elizabeth, of all people, was an atheist, I mean, surely they did not mean that Elizabeth didn't believe in God. Similarly, when someone says that Calvin, is an atheist, surely they don't mean that Calvin doesn't believe in God. What they really mean is Calvin believes in the wrong kind of God. But having said that, there is evidence that people were saying that God doesn't exist, that the human soul is no different than an animal soul, that there is no justice. These existed as accusations, but there's enough of them for us to be pretty sure that somebody was saying this.
So sort of a blanket term for anything that's outside of what whoever is using the term considers acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, there were also more specific usages of it. And they're all kind of jumbled together like a giant bowl of spaghetti.
Were there any established communities of people who called themselves atheist in the contemporary meaning of the word living in England during Shakespeare's lifetime, where someone would have owned that term and said, yes, I am an atheist?
In short, no. No. Unless they were suicidal. And that did not happen. Here's the weird thing about early modern atheism. There are any number of accusations of atheism. There's any number of books and sermons attacking atheism, condemning atheism. The Spanish ambassador in the early 17th century said that there were 90,000 atheists running around England. Thomas Nash said something similar in one of his books. So you have atheism is kind of all over the place. And as I discovered using Ebo, that the instances in which people talk about atheism actually significantly clicks up as the latter part of the 16th century happens and then just keeps going. But you don't find anybody openly saying, I am an atheist. I do not believe in God. Or if there is a God, there is no justice there. What you get are refracted statements. That is to say, well, as I've kind of figured out, you find it in the drama, where you will have characters saying stuff like that. Shakespeare's Aaron in Titus Andronicus will say he does not believe in God, and other characters will kind of confirm that. And then you get, a little bit before that, Tamburlaine, you're going to get that. Salimus, the play by Robert Greene, you're going to see that. But do you have person X, publishing as people have done today, why I do not believe in God? No, that would get you killed.
Now, you're talking about books and pamphlets, and these people are speaking out saying atheism is bad, but these records are coming from a lot of different directions in terms of the people who are writing them. So I'm presuming that speaking out against atheism was to say, here are the things you should not do. So were there any themes or generalities about, if they're proclaiming don't do these things, don't be an atheist, what were they decrying? What was it that they were saying, here's what you should avoid?
That's one of the peculiar things about this. It's really not clear what these denunciations are responding to. Stephen Greenblatt famously wrote that atheism in the early modern period always seemed to be the thought of somebody else, or, as happens once or twice, the thought of someone who's had one too many drinks and is just kind of going on. I mean, most of the time it's, be a good Christian, which means be a good Protestant, which means be a good Anglican, which means do what the Queen says.
Toe the line, yes.
Yes, that's generally what they are talking about. But what all of these references, denunciations of atheism, what exactly they are referring to, that's really not clear. Let me give you another example, sort of a perfect example of how this works. 1592, Robert Parsons, Catholic polemicist, writes in one of his books an accusation that Sir Walter Raleigh is an atheist, that he oversees something called the School of Night. Now, Raleigh was kind of at the center of this intellectual group, Thomas Carey and Harriet, one or two other people. But there's really no indication that these people they're interested in science, they're interested in history, they sit around and they talk, and probably they aired some opinions that were probably not entirely orthodox, but declaring that God doesn't exist, that I don't think so. Nonetheless, Parsons, using atheism as I've said, this kind of catch-all, accuses Raleigh of atheism. For some reason, this takes fire. And the government actually says, okay, we need to investigate this. And they set up a commission, and they send these commissioners with 9 questions, depositions, to Cerne Abbas. And they ask a bunch of people, predominantly clerics. Have you ever heard this? Has anyone said this? Who has said this? When has they said this? Did Raleigh say this? And almost all of the respondents say, no, I have never heard this myself, but my neighbor has. One person, it's actually kind of wonderful, says, I've never heard this, but a barber heard it from somebody else who heard it from somebody else. I mean, it's like this snipe hunt.
Everybody's like, I'm not touching this.
I'm not going near this, but it's somebody else who had heard. And so they would go to that person and say, well, did you hear this? I said, well, no, but I heard it from the guy across the street. So they go to the guy across the street. So everyone had heard that there was, more or less everyone had heard that there was atheism, that Raleigh had said X, Y, Z, but nobody has firsthand knowledge of this. And then there was one poor guy who really did have far too much to drink, said something seriously untoward, and he was told, apparently, go sleep it off. It's kind of wonderful.
You can't possibly mean what you're talking about.
Exactly. You've had far too much to drink. We're not going to take you seriously.
So we've mentioned Elizabeth I and just shockingly John Calvin. If there's anybody who could never be accused of being an atheist,
right.
Calvin. But how does this, play out? Obviously Raleigh was taken to court in a sense, and at least an investigation was done. But what were the outcomes of this? When you were accused of being an atheist, what does that play out like? Are there reprimands? Are there punishments? Are you, removed from your job? Was this effectively the cancel culture of the 16th century?
Actually, from what I can tell, not really. Okay. Now, most of the examples that I found which I didn't personally find. I mean, I'm relying on Michael Hunter and a variety of other critics. They're the ones who have scoured the archives for these things. And I just follow them and happily plagiarize them. For the most part, they don't say what happened to these people. There was one case, however, where one poor soul, 1587, Augustin Draper of Essex, found himself indicted, quote, for disbeliefs of the immortality of the soul, and here's the fate worse than death, not canceled, but sentenced to repeated conferences in the parish church with 3 divines until he was persuaded otherwise.
He was sent to catechism camp.
See, exactly. No, God, as I said, probably a fate worse than death. He probably, no, I completely recant. I mean,
wow.
On the other hand, and this comes from a report of cases where, again, I'm following the trail, the footnote trail, where one John Minot, and interesting, he's a lay reader for a parish church. So this is a guy who's licensed to church. I mean, licensed to preach. So he's presumably not completely ignorant and conduct, religious services. Nonetheless, quote, hath openly and manifestly reported that there is no God, no devil, no heaven, no hell, no life after this life, no judgment to come. Unfortunately, the case report doesn't say what happened to him.
I was sitting on pins and needles.
Right.
I was waiting. Okay, what did they do?
Dude, what are you? That's what we want. Nonetheless.
But it's just not there.
It's
wow.
And actually, in preparation for this podcast, I went back, checked the reference, and it's not there. I mean, but this is a perfect example, nonetheless, of someone who really is accused of contemporary evidence. There is no God.
Yeah.
Well, what part of that do you not understand? What part of that is ambiguous? But again, he was accused of this. We don't have him actually saying there is no God. And there's example after example after example of these, ecclesiastical courts, sometimes star chambers, so it means it actually did get to a fairly high level of these accusations floating around. On the other hand, or it's not really on the other hand, there was another case where a guy was accused, of elder abuse of all things, and they just seemed to throw in atheism, for good measure.
You referred to this previously, but tell us more about how plays, and specifically Tamburlaine, which was first written in the 1580s, how is that play helpful in understanding how atheism was viewed for Shakespeare's lifetime?
Marlowe writes these 2 plays, Tamburlaine, Part 1, and it is, if not the first blockbuster, it certainly was among the first blockbuster. Everybody loved this play, which is really kind of amazing because A, it's extremely violent, and B, what Marlowe is saying, or has his characters say in this play. Remember, Tamburlaine explicitly is someone who starts off as a shepherd, says, guess what? I'm going to rule the world. And does. So, breaks every single rule when it comes to class. Now, as part of these plays, Tamburlaine really more in part 2, Tamburlaine doesn't deny that there are gods. In fact, he calls himself the scourge of God, or the scourge of the gods. But if this is what the gods are promoting, I mean, this is a guy who regularly commits mass murder. No problems with that at all. Is this what gods are supporting? It's like, what is that saying about the nature of the universe? What is that saying about God?
Well, it's very Old Testament. I'll throw that out there because there's the biblical character of Joseph who follows that exact path, but starts out as a shepherd, tells his brothers he's going to rule the world, and then ends up a prince of Egypt. So and then of course God swallowing entire people groups into the earth. It sounds very Old Testament to me. And if you're going to make that analogy of how could God support this, there's something to that, I think. That's a side note we don't have to chase, but I'm throwing it out there.
What happened with Joseph is quite Tamberlane. And yeah, I mean, the 16th, 17th century, the early modern period was, from one angle, quite explicit about the class hierarchy in a way that ancient Israelites were not.
Sure.
And that's why, he starts off by saying, even though I am a shepherd, now I'm going to take off my shepherd's weeds. I am now going to rule the world. And all the way through Tamberlane, his enemies constantly go, oh, how horrible that someone so low can deem to challenge us who are so high. And of course, then he sticks a knife into them, and the audience goes, yay. Because
so many mafia themes here.
Exactly. It's basically early modernites meets The Godfather or The Sopranos. But there's one crucial little moment in Tamberlane Part 2 where Tamberlane says, and this is just after he burns the Quran, and then says that I notice I live untouched by Muhammad. Okay. But then he says a little bit later on, whether Muhammad remains in hell, he cannot hear the voice of Tamberlane. Seek out another Godhead to adore. The God that sits in heaven, if any God, for he is God alone. If any God, just drops it in there. Drops it in. And also, a little bit earlier in the play, the Christian forces break a treaty with the Muslim forces. Needless to say, the Muslim forces are not, leaders are not terribly happy about this and say, how can Christians be so dishonest, et cetera, et cetera. So the Christians always look bad, and the Muslim forces are actually clearly in the right here. So the two of them meet in battle, and the Muslim forces are, they're successful. And at one point, actually, the Muslim general says, Christ or Muhammad helped me, which is kind of amazingly ecumenical of him. But does say, oh, the God or gods, whoever it is, helped me, divine help. And another general just says, no, it was the fortune of war. We just beat them. We were better than they were. There's nothing supernatural about this. Now, Tamberlane, to say that Tamberlane was popular is, kind of like saying Star Wars was popular. Everyone saw it was incredibly popular. So that everyone actually or not everyone, but this is now permeating popular cultures. Lots of people have heard this. And there's lots of other examples about how apparently Tamberlane has more contemporary comments than any other play. Really kind of fascinating.
I'm really surprised by this because, Richard II calls all kinds of problems for Shakespeare because of a single abdication scene. And then Ben Jonson ends up in jail for the subversive things that his play Isle of Dogs just seemed to suggest. How is Tamberlane able to portray the Muslims and the Ottoman Turks as winning against the Christians, not just immediately squashed for that alone, much less his statements that are seemingly atheistic when you're telling us all about how condemning it was to even be associated with atheism?
Great question. So glad you asked. As it happens, I wrote a book on this. Early Modern Others, available from Amazon and any other bookstore. Please consider buying it. I have a retirement that I need to fund. So think about it. Okay. Starting with Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson got into real trouble. I think it was Ben Jonson and Thomas Nash and a couple of other people, because he made fun of the Spanish ambassador. So, it's an actual guy. At the same time that James's government is negotiating with this guy. So it didn't help. That's why they shut him down. Now, as for Richard II, Shakespeare never got into any trouble at all about this. That comes from Essex, Robert Devereux, a lunatic at this point, who thinks that he is going to stage this play and that people will watch this play and suddenly realize that Elizabeth needs to be deposed and join him in this. Didn't work out that way. But apparently the authorities who, took Essex extremely seriously and, he was executed for treason, they didn't touch the players. Not quite sure why, but they didn't touch the players. So Shakespeare never dealt with that. Generally speaking, also, Richard II. Okay, sort of a long story, so I'm going to make it extremely, extremely short.
Okay, we're ready.
Great. There are two kinds of kingship in the early modern period, two kinds of monarchy. Absolute monarchy. Monarch is above the law. Supposedly can't touch him. So there's absolute kingship. But England has never, ever been, except for a very, very brief period under Charles I, I'll get to him in a second, absolute. Instead, what they have always had is what's called limited monarchy, mixed monarchy, where there are these unwritten rules, generally known in the 17th century as the ancient constitution, limiting monarchic power. The actual Richard II broke those rules, and eventually he was impeached. And there's this, in both the chronicles of the period, Hall and Holinshed, there's a list of the 16 or 17 items. It's actually slightly more than that. But number 16 is the one that I always quote, and I absolutely love this one because it says that Richard, quote, had the fantasy that the laws of England were in his breast or his head. That's absolutely ridiculous. The only monarch to try and actually rule without parliament as an absolute monarch was Charles I. Look what happened to him. Didn't work. So staging the deposition of Richard II, that would not have raised any eyebrows at all. That's part of English history. And in fact, they were very, very proud of it because it showed that monarchs were not absolute. Monarchs were accountable. Now, how did what I was just saying about atheism and the like, again, simply put, there was more room in the center of this culture for dissent, for contrary views than we tend to allow for today. Yes, they had to be, the plays had to be vetted by the master of the revels. And sometimes the master of the revels is a famous instance of it, the manuscript of the Book of Sir Thomas More, as it's called today, where the guy just did a line through it and said, drop this, because they felt that the riot scene would have been incendiary. But the evidence, in a sense, speaks for itself. Marlowe's play, and it's not the only one. I mean, Jew of Malta does something very, very similar. And then you have, what's it called again? The Spanish Tragedy, and you've got Titus Andronicus, all of which challenge conventional notions of morality, all of which say there is no justice in this world. Titus has the scene where literally there's a bunch of arrows going up in the air, aimed at the gods. What goes up must come down. And he says, Astrea has left. There is no justice in this world. And this was not only tolerated by the authorities, these plays were momentously successful, which would suggest or evidence for that people were allowed to entertain such views, that there was pushback against conventional notions of morality and justice, so long as you didn't take it one step further and challenge the actual monarch. Meaning, I am now going to take up arms, or making fun of Elizabeth herself, mocking Elizabeth herself. That was where they drew the line. But challenging whether there is justice in this world, whether there actually is a God, that seemed to be allowed. Now, moving back to atheism and drama. So you've got Tamberlane. Then a little while later, a year or two later, Robert Greene, who was famous in his time, but he was a hack writer. Essentially, he wrote, sorry, it's true.
You didn't see me make a shocked face. Poor Robert.
Not at all. No, poor Robert Greene. I mean, the guy wanted to make a living, so he wrote what he thought would be popular. Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. He was an opportunist for sure. We'll give him that.
I mean, as I said, guys trying to make a living. What can we say? He was a contemporary script writer, not everyone can write The Godfather. There are romances, Harlequin romances, whatever. So then he tries to get on this train, and he writes a play called Selimus. Now, what's interesting about Selimus, this is now explicitly, the Selimus is explicitly atheistic. In fact, in ways that are, shocking even today. As he says, religion is but a bugbear to keep men in fear. The end. And this is in the beginning of Scene 2. And the speech goes on for quite some time. So this isn't, Marlowe's one little, clause. This is like 50, 100 lines, something like that. He keeps going on like this. And then he says, since there is no afterlife at all, and the bad get the same reward as the good, which is nothing, well, so then I'll have a snatch at all, which is kind of exactly what people feared about atheism. That if people did not believe in God, then how do you maintain civil order?
Well, it's interesting that you're bringing up who this play was written for, because in his work, Early Modern Others, Peter writes about atheism being spread around the country somewhat clandestinely, but he talks about traveling playing companies playing a specific role here. Peter, tell us about how the fact that the playing companies were traveling around was influencing atheism at this time.
Well, the playing company, I'm sure there were others, but the main one we're talking about was the Queen's Mint. And they specialized in essentially patriotic potboilers. They did a play on Henry V, for example. I think they did a play. Yeah, they did a play on King Lear. And Greene wrote this play, wrote Selimus for the Queen's Mint. And these people are traveling all around England. So imagine you are in a small town in England, and you get to see a play. And this probably was a pretty exciting thing because, like, they show up and say, oh my God, these strangers, it would be like, the circus has come to town. And so everyone then goes to see this play. And then you have this figure, Selimus. And this just keeps going on and on. How long does this go on for? Let me quickly see. Line 1 through, oh my God, I was wrong. 160. It's 160 lines here. Right. 160 lines here. And in the middle of this, you hear this guy say that some sage man above the vulgar wise, knowing that laws could not in quiet dwell unless they were observed, did first devise the names of God, religion, heaven, and hell, and gan of pains and feigned rewards to tell. Pains for those men which did neglect the laws, rewards for those that lived in quiet awe, whereas indeed they were mere fictions. And if they were not, Selim thinks they were. And these religious observations only bugbears to keep the world in fear and make men quietly a yoke to bear. So that religion of itself, a bauble, was only found to make us peaceable. And this continues. And you can imagine that at least some people in the audience were horrified at this, and they started throwing rotten fruit at the poor actor who has to deal with this. But I also can imagine that there were other people who were kind of going, yeah, that's what I think. I'm not going to say it because I do not feel like being disemboweled, but
not today.
Not today. Today is not a good day to die. This is not the hill I'm going to die on. Who are going to nod and go, yeah, this is what I mean. So this is kind of spreading around. Now, what's also interesting is that apparently, well, two things. One, Selimus ends the play entirely successful. So if, as with Tamburlaine, which Robert Greene is referencing left, right, and center in this play, if you're looking for someone to say something like that and then be punished, which would confirm orthodoxy, saying religion is but a bugbear to keep men in fear, zap, that's not happening. So the play endorses Selimus. So, but it wasn't terribly successful. Greene promised another, to do Selimus Part 2, and it never showed up. Maybe he just got bored of the topic. However, there was one reader we know that did pay attention to Selimus, and that is William Shakespeare, because Shakespeare uses Selimus as a source for King Lear. And King Lear takes this one step further. Now, the scene I'm about to describe is in both the quarto and the folio. So we don't have to deal with the headache of which is the right one, and the whole editing issue. No, this is in both of them, where Gloucester, who has been blinded, wandering along, bumps into his abused son, Edgar, says that he wants to commit suicide and his sole wish is to say, I'm sorry to Edgar. And Edgar hears this. And he doesn't go, Dad, it's me. Let me help you. No, he pretends to be yet another figure who then leads Gloucester to what he thinks is a cliff, the White Cliffs of Dover, which, we've all seen pictures of it. Those are very steep cliffs.
Straight drop, yes.
Straight drop. Now, In fact, they are on the rough equivalent of a prairie right now. It is flat. The end. And the scene veers into, the theater of the absurd, where, Gloucester says, are we going uphill? And Edgar says, oh, yeah, we most certainly are. So, I don't know. It feels kind of flat to me. And this kind of goes on like this. So he tricks him into thinking that he's about to go over. As I said, he's actually in Nebraska right now, about as flat as you're going to get. But here's the crucial thing. Edgar then switches roles again. I think this is like the third role that he has taken on. And then tells his father that his life's a miracle, that it was a demon that led him to the cliff. But when he jumped off, he floated down like a feather. And that the gods have preserved him. We all see that this is a lie, a fiction, untruth, but it's necessary because it temporarily cures Gloucester's despair. But the play enacts what the other plays kind of hint at. There are no gods. There's no supernatural. It's all a lie.
Obviously, there's a lot to unpack here when it comes to understanding atheism in Shakespeare's lifetime and how that interacts with the history of the plays like Shakespeare's and Marlowe's and others. And I am obviously the best place to start would be with Early Modern Others by Peter Herman. But Peter, I know you've mentioned that you did a lot of research, and there are several other works of researchers who scoured the archives, as you said, to find some details that we should also look into if this is a topic we want to research further. So what resources can you recommend for us as a good place to begin if we'd like to dive into this part of history?
Unfortunately, there is no popular trade book on the topic, like, Stephen Greenblatt's or Jim Shapiro's books. So to access this stuff, these works, you're going to need a library. I mean, it's not a problem if you're a professor. It might be a little bit more difficult if you're not. But the main people to go to would be Michael Hunter, who has who has a book which collects his essays, and David Wooten, Wootten. These are, Stephen Greenblatt is also very good, famous essay in, what's the name of it? In Shakespearean Negotiations, also on this. But for something like this, you're going to need to go to the historians. Curiously, atheism is not a topic that is popular. There have been a number of books and anthologies on early modern religion, for example, and I'm not going to name names on this, but if you look at the indices, atheism is not part of that. So, I mean, they tend to give this, this appearance that while there's any number of, theologians in the period arguing about the proper understanding of God, atheism isn't part of that. You're going to have to go outside of those books. As said, Michael Hunter, David Wooten, and my chapter on atheism in Early Modern Others. Great introduction. Follow the footnotes. They won't lead you wrong.
We will link to these articles in the show notes for today's episode. And even if you're not a professor, if you take these citations to your local library and tell them you would like to read these papers, they can help you get a copy of them. Also, I'll suggest Google Scholar is a decent place to look if you're trying to track down digital online copies. Sometimes academic articles are available there to read online, so that would be a good place to check as well. But I will definitely and forever support our public library system here in the US, but also in the UK and others. If you go to a local library, they're always excited to help you track down the history when you want to learn more. So some great places to begin.
Interlibrary loan.
It's a wonderful set of words. Yes.
It is. Couldn't survive without it.
Absolutely not. Peter, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Contemporary literary critical book or book?
It is your island. You get to choose.
It is my island. Okay. I think the best literary critical book that I would take would be Stephen Greenblatt's Tyrant. It explains the world. Other than that, surprisingly, I think I would take the Harry Potter books.
That's a good choice. I don't think I've had anyone select that, but now that you've mentioned it, that would be an entertaining selection for a deserted island.
I love the Harry Potter books. I've always loved them. I love them from when they first started coming out. I think they are just wondrous.
Well, you'd be well set up there on your deserted island with that selection. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm really excited about an article that's forthcoming on different topic. Philip Roth, reading Philip Roth after 10-7, or since it's a Australian or based in Australia, 7-10 or 10-7, 7 July, 7 October, I'm sorry. That's going to be forthcoming in Quillette, Quillettee. In terms of early modern scholarship, I'm going back to the history plays, because the history plays are kind of forgotten. They're not all that popular today. And I think that these plays are absolutely magnificent. I have an article also where it was just published a little while ago on how Shakespeare's Henriade, it's called Shakespeare in the Book of Henry, how the Henriade, Richard II, 1 and 2 Henry IV, and then Henry V, actually reads as a unified play, as a unified book. And there's evidence that Shakespeare revised these as he went along, and he emphasized the connections between the plays. And I want to go back and put that into the context of, and this is going to sound really boring, early modern historiography, which I think was just a lot more contestatory than people have generally allowed. There was a notion that Hall and Holinshed was essentially Tudor propaganda, and that's just not true. Some years ago, far too long ago for me to actually remember, Annabelle Patterson published this really, really great book, Reading Holinshed's Chronicles. And I had thought that book would kind of spark a rethinking of Shakespeare's history plays. And it didn't, so far as I can tell. And so I want to go back and do that revision, starting with the articles, revising the articles I've written on early modern historical writing, and then how that shows up in Shakespeare's history plays, both of the trilogies, also the Henry VI plays, and then the Henriade, and also any other history plays I can figure out. That's what I want to do.
It sounds like you have quite a quest mapped out for yourself, and I'll be excited to hear what you discover in looking into these history plays with that new light there. I wish you the very best on those forthcoming projects. Thank you so much, Peter Herman, for being here this week to help us understand atheism for Shakespeare's lifetime. It's been an interesting conversation, and we've enjoyed having you visit with us today.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you so much for asking me.
As I've mentioned, all the resources that Peter recommends for you today will be linked with their official citations in the show notes for today's episode. That's also where you can find more information about Peter and his book, Early Modern Others. Find all of these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 332. That's CassidyCash.com/EP332. If you would like to see more in-depth history related to our show today, including some portraits of the people that were accused of being atheist, along with some of the pamphlets and writings and primary documents that we talked about today that are related to atheism in Shakespeare's lifetime, I've packed all of that into our detailed show notes. All of these insider extras are available for patrons of our show, and they expand right on the regular show notes page. There's a button at the bottom of the page that says Become a Patron. You can either sign in there if you're already a patron of our show, or you can use that button to join us as a patron, and all of this extra content will expand right there on the show notes page. Again, that's CassidyCash.com/episode 332. That Shakespeare Life is completely free to listen here each week, and your support makes that possible. To support That Shakespeare Life, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Patrons get to see behind-the-scenes content of the making of our show, and they can contribute to episodes like this one by submitting your own questions you'd like asked live on the air. In addition to these insider extras, patrons also get special bonuses like 20% off all of the products in our shop and access to history bonuses like classroom content, activities, virtual tours, and so much more. Explore all the benefits of being a patron of That Shakespeare Life and join today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.